Hello again, and we're back with another episode on history of ancient Egypt, presented by Professor Breyer. And just to reiterate, I know how YouTube be tripping. This is an audiobook that I have purchased online through Amazon. Great Courses, I believe, is where I purchased it. They have many different topics to choose from. I chose this one. I've always been curious about ancient Egypt. You know, last year I came across a couple of videos, YouTube videos, about Dr. Clark, Henry Clark, and two things he said that stuck with me. One, two things can be true at the same time. A lot of people think that because one thing is true, something else has to be a lie. That's not always the case. Two things about the same subject can be true at the same time. And when I thought about it, I said, you know, he's right. He's right. I can't even argue with that. If you ever just sit down and think about things, think about how some things are true and other things society says is a lie. If you just sit down and think about, just use common sense. Just use common sense, and you will realize that no, it's not a lie. It's the truth. Both things are true. So, that being said, let us get ready to go into today's discussion.
Other than a museum object, so there was no conservation done on it. And in the humid atmosphere of Cairo, it was starting to grow fungi, right? And it was starting to decay. You could actually see 19th century photos of Ramses and 20th century photos of Ramses, and you could see the decay. So something had to be done. Now, the mummy of Ramses the Great is the only pharaoh's mummy ever to leave Egypt, right? It was decided that Ramses had to be refurbished, saved. So the mummy was flown to France. It was going to be worked on at the Museum of Man by a team of scientists to see what they could do about stopping the fungi, reversing the damage, and fixing Ramses. Interesting story, by the way. How do you get the mummy of a king through customs? What do you label him as? When he touched down, when the plane touched down in Paris, he was given the full treatment of a head of state, of a visiting head of state, right? The band was there because he was a king of Egypt. So he was given the full treatment, Ramses, and taken to the museum. And then the study began. They had to be very gentle with Ramses. I mean, you know, it is a 3,000-year-old mummy. And so gentle, for example, he was flown in the coffin that he had been in. It was a modern coffin that they made for him on display, but they didn't want to lift him up even. So they cut the end of the coffin and slid him out rather than lifting it. They were just afraid to really do almost anything to him. So they studied him, and they found 89 different species of fungi on Ramses, right? And they had to kill these fungi. The problem is, of course, how do you do that without damaging the mummy itself? You can't heat it. You might normally try to heat it. You can't even freeze it because it would contract and perhaps that would cause damage. What do you do? They finally hit on a solution that has been used in operating rooms for years. Gamma ray sterilization. You very often, by the way, surgical tools are gamma ray irradiated. That's how you sterilize them. You nuke them, basically, and they're perfectly sterile. And this doesn't cause changes. Has that great advantage. So they nuked
Unless you're Mark
Ramses.
Ruffalo.
They irradiated them with gamma rays. But before they did that, they took pieces of unimportant mummies and tested it to see if there was any change in the color of the skin, for example. They even used some parchment as a test. So Ramses was irradiated, and that was good. That worked just fine. In the future, by the way, there may be a problem with that. Just maybe. This was before anybody ever thought about doing DNA studies on mummies, and we don't know what gamma ray irradiation has done to the DNA of Ramses the Great, whether we'll be able to recover it now in future studies. But at least the fungi were killed and Ramses was sterile. Now, how do you keep Ramses sterile? Well, the Getty Museum helps here. Now remember, the Getty Museum are the ones that restored the tomb of Nefertari, Ramses' wife. So it's kind of nice that they had a part in restoring Ramses the Great. They designed a case. They wanted a case that was simple. Very simple, which you could keep them low maintenance, that could be maintained in Cairo quite easily. And they came upon the solution of nitrogen. Let me explain. When the components of air was first discovered, remember the old chemistry in Lavoisier and the French figuring out what the parts of air was? They called nitrogen azote. Now, the French word azote really it means without life, azote, without life. And they called nitrogen azote because when they did experiments and put little animals like mice in nitrogen, they died because there's no oxygen. So nothing could live in an atmosphere of nitrogen. So they designed a case, the Getty designed a case, plexiglass case, with an atmosphere of nitrogen in it. And Ramses would put inside that case so that now nothing is going to grow in that case. He's virtually sterile. The shipment, by the way, back was really quite interesting because they didn't want to open the case and then let things in. You want nitrogen. And they shipped the case in a kind of almost like these bubbles that you put children without immune systems in, and they had tools and everything to install Ramses in his coffin in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. So he's there, and he's, as we say, dead and well. The mummy has been refurbished, rewrapped. It's doing fine. But let me tell you about what we learn about Ramses from the mummy itself. It's a different picture from what you get when you read the temple inscriptions that Ramses left us. You know, there's a tendency to think always of Ramses as this youthful guy riding off into battle. He's got all these wives. He's got, 100 kids. Everything is fine on the Nile. Ramses died a cripple, probably. Now, remember, he ruled for 67 years. He's probably about 88 years old when he dies. That's quite an age in Egypt. He is the second longest reigning monarch for Egypt. Think back to the Old Kingdom. Remember the end of the Old Kingdom? The Old Kingdom ended with Pepi II, a pharaoh who reigned for 94 years. The longest reigning monarch in the history of the world. Ruled for 94 years. He was a child, of course, when he took over. But remember we talked about that may have been the reason why Egypt went downhill. The pharaoh was supposed to be the physical leader of the country. He wasn't like the prime minister or the president. He had to physically lead the army. So maybe Egypt went downhill under Pepi II because he couldn't maintain the army anymore. He wasn't looking after business. The same thing may have happened with Ramses. In his late 80s when he dies, he certainly didn't ride out anymore. Maybe he couldn't even take care of business. So possibly the age of Ramses may even contribute to this decline that we're going to see today in the 19th dynasty. But there's other great things about the mummy of Ramses. I mean, he's one thing, for example, we know he suffered from arteriosclerosis, right? X-rays of Ramses can show that the arteries are clogged. The femoral arteries, as a matter of fact, are clogged. He also had a terrible infection in the mandible. Terrible. Massive. He may have even died from it. Remember, the Egyptians had no way of treating infection. They had no germ theory. They had no idea of what was causing this. And Ramses' mandible shows a tremendous infection. It was common for Egyptians to suffer tooth decay, but not because of our common, our causes like sugar. No. They didn't have a lot of sugar in their diet. The wealthy maybe had honey. What caused the decay was their bread. Commoners and kings ate the same kind of bread, basically. It was stone ground. And as the bread was stone ground, you get a little bit of the stone in your grain. Not only that, if you've got a desert country, sand's blowing into it. So when you bake your bread, it's got quite a bit of grit in it. And as you chew it, you're literally sanding down your teeth. Almost all the mummies I examine, even young ones, have teeth that are worn down from chewing this bread. Now what that does is it exposes the pulp of the tooth, and that's when you get your decay. So it's not because of sugars or honey or whatever, it's because of these ground down teeth, and that may have really ultimately done in Ramses the Great.
That is crazy. So evidently they had tooth decay back in those days too, but it was for a different reason. Wow. Gnashing of teeth. Wow. Ground bread. That's crazy. So Ramses and other mummies are suffering from tooth decay because of the way they're cooking their breads. You got particles of sand, you got particles of the stones. As a society, we have come a long way with sterilization and filtration techniques. It had to be rough. It had to be rough back then, man. And I believe that was before false teeth was invented, so it's not like they could, pay a physician to make them some false teeth. Well, that's interesting. We will stop here. But it's not over. It's not over. There's so much more to talk about. Let's discuss this in the comments below. And I will talk to you later.